Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning.
Welcome back, 16 to 1 listeners. This is your co-host and producer, Chelsea, and thanks for joining us in the new year. We're back from our winter break and kicking off 2025 with a special guest episode of the podcast. It was recorded late last year with Jeremy C. Young, the Director of State and Higher Education Policy at PEN America, a nonprofit organization that unites writers and their allies to defend the freedom of expression nationwide. He oversees PEN America's state policy and advocacy work across all U.S. free expression programs and directs the Freedom to Learn program fighting government censorship of colleges and universities. His commentary on issues of academic freedom, higher education, and American democracy appears frequently in media outlets, and he speaks regularly on these topics before national and international audiences. A historian by training, Young is the author of The Age of Charisma, Leaders, Followers, and Emotions in American Society, 1870 to 1940. We had a great time speaking with Jeremy, and we hope you enjoy the conversation as well. Thanks for listening. I think we kind of wanted to start with what might be a broader question for the PEN America work that you do. We wanted to get a sense of the current state of, or maybe trends in, censorship and book banning efforts across the country, educational institutions, higher ed, and public schools. Where are things? Where are we now? Give us the most up-to-date information on what's going on right now.
Well, we are into really completing year 4 of a full-on public panic about education that has led to widespread censorship in both K-12 and higher ed. And there's no real signs of that censorship abating, but it definitely is changing. And it's changing in part because there have been some legal setbacks in the higher ed space against what we call educational gag orders, censorship bills about critical race theory, which have been struck down or partially struck down in a couple of states. They're actually in the K-12 space as well. There have been some political challenges to book banning, with school boards full of book banners losing elections in a couple of successive cycles. And so instead, what we're seeing more broadly is a shift away from laws that directly censor educators and more towards stealthy attempts to carry out censorship. So a couple of states passed a couple of years ago state laws about really turbocharging book banning opportunities for individual parents to ban books that can cover an entire school district or an entire state in some cases with a single challenge. But it doesn't have the lawmakers' fingerprints on it. They're not the ones doing the banning. They're just making it so that parents can do it. Similarly, on the higher ed side, we're seeing some laws that say that they're about things like viewpoint diversity or combating anti-Semitism that are really doing the same work as the censorship laws of the previous few years. There's a lot of restrictions in higher ed about university governance, making it so that universities can't create DEI offices or maintain them or determine their own curricula or majors and minors, accreditation, things like that. And then finally, a trend toward jawboning, threats and bullying coming from lawmakers directly to leaders of universities saying, well, you just make the cuts yourself and then we won't cut your funding next year. So really a move to carry out the same kind of censorship, but a little bit more under the radar than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, I remember when you and I were talking on our introductory call, we kind of touched on a little bit what's happening in Florida. I mentioned we're in Ohio here, and we just have been having this House Bill 8 argument, and it kind of passed in a late night legislative session. It has been interesting, though, to see these things going into the direction of being led by parents.
Well, and I would argue even House Bill 8, I mean, that's a parental rights bill. So a lot of what it includes is mechanisms that make it super easy for individual parents, or in this case, Moms for Liberty, to carry out censorship without the government explicitly doing it themselves. Mm-hmm. So it is more stealthy than a book ban or a bill that bans certain texts or titles.
Yeah.
Do you think there's more power in doing it that way, Jeremy? Or do you think that this is an effort to try to make it appear as it's not being done by the lawmakers themselves? Do you have a read on that?
It depends on your goals, really. I mean, if your goal is to hold a bunch of big splashy press conferences and then run for president saying that you're the state where woke goes to die, like Ron DeSantis, then no, you want to be the person who is banning CRT, banning DEI, banning books. You want that to be you. If the goal is just to get the ban in place, whether or not you get credit for it, because your real goal is to actually ban ideas, then yeah, the stealthier the better. And that's both because it creates fewer opportunities for legislation to be challenged at a hearing or for people to fight back, and also because it's harder to challenge in court. If there's nothing written down, if there's no law where the legislature itself is banning certain things, then it's harder for the court to come in. I mean, we saw this even with the private right of action in Texas with abortion, right? That idea is getting ported into education a lot. That we're not going to make it illegal. We're not going to enforce it on the basis of the legislature. It's going to be individual citizens who are going to enforce these things against each other, and that's a really effective way to make it stick legally.
We were just at the NCTE conference for English teachers in Boston, and we were hearing from a lot of teachers resonating with what you're saying about where these efforts are directing. They're more trying to fly under the radar now. And I'm curious if you see this in the numbers. Does it feel like a single splashy act of censorship is often followed up by more of this kind of covert action? I'm just curious about how these movements take shape over time and trying to figure out where we are now. It feels like something is changing in the way this stuff is picking up steam, but I don't know, resistance is starting to happen too in a more organized manner.
Yeah, I think all those things are happening. There is more resistance, and I think that the combination of more effective resistance on the one hand and the lawmakers who really stick their necks out on this, like DeSantis getting sort of slapped down for it on the other, has led to a situation where you really want to restrict education. It's easier to do it in ways that don't attract notice, that make it that sort of flummox resistors. Even some of the laws we tracked in 2024 at the higher ed level were rushed through the legislative process in a way that prevented them from having a hearing. You know, Iowa passed the most draconian DEI ban in the country, and they did it by sliding it into a budget bill on the last day of session. So, there were no hearings, there was no opportunity to fight it. And that's intentional because at this point, we are at a point in 2024 or 2025 where anytime one of these bills gets a hearing, the hearing is packed with people opposing it. That is not where we were when we started tracking this in 2021 and 2022. It would happen maybe once or twice a year.
Have we gotten to the point yet where some of these more restrictive measures are meeting court challenges? Some of it's happening in real time, but I feel like some of this legislation has got to be old enough now where court challenges might be starting to make a difference in their implementation. Yes.
So the ACLU challenged the Stop Woke Act, the higher ed portion of the Stop Woke Act in Florida, which actually had three portions: a K-12 portion, which has not yet been successfully challenged, the higher ed portion, and then a portion that applied to private employers. That portion was challenged in a separate case, defeated, and the state has given up. They're still fighting over the higher ed portion, but the trial judge concluded very quickly that it was unconstitutional on a whole host of grounds and struck it down. It's still going through the appellate process. But I think that case really demonstrates the limits of what court action can do, because that case was filed over 2 years ago. The trial judge was very concerned, put in a preliminary injunction 4.5 months after the law took effect. Well, we still haven't gotten a ruling from the appellate court, and it's been over 2 years now since that preliminary injunction went into place. Of course, there would be a Supreme Court challenge presumably after that. In Oklahoma, where there was a challenge against a similar law, the trial court judge didn't rule until over 2 years after the law went into effect. And in New Hampshire, a state that is in one of the friendliest circuit courts in the country for constitutional challenges of these things, the court also, this was a K-12 bill, the court also did not rule until over 2 years after the bill had gone into effect, and then declared it completely unconstitutional. So we're talking a very long time horizon, and it's very easy to pass these bills, do a lot of mischief, and then the program that you're trying to restrict or ban is gone by the time the courts finally rule that it's unconstitutional.
Yep. Okay, well, let's get a little into more your area of expertise, and I guess that's higher ed. I want to talk with you a bit about educational gag orders. You're already discussing this, but broadly speaking, what are they? Where are they being implemented? how are they impacting teaching and learning and, civic discourse in the classroom?
So we track a couple of different kinds of legislation. Originally, our program was created to track this thing we call educational gag orders, which is really direct legislative censorship of educators' speech in the classroom. So educational gag orders traditionally were these sort of divisive concepts bills that banned CRT or claimed to ban critical race theory, but actually banned this sort of set of 9 very vague ideas that nobody could really understand what they were or weren't, banning nothing and everything all at once from the classroom. And those bills were, they grew out of an executive order President Trump issued in September of 2020 that was repealed on the first day of the Biden administration. But they began to appear in legislation in states in 2021 where they were mostly aimed at K-12, but also at higher ed. They really picked up in 2022. There was a huge avalanche of them, almost 150 bills introduced in 2022 across the country. And then in 2023, we began to see those type of bills decline. They're still introduced and passed from time to time. But increasingly, we're seeing a new type of bill introduced in higher ed, which focuses specifically on issues of university autonomy and governance. So instead of banning a teacher from saying something in a classroom, something that I think even the proponents of these ideas are starting to recognize is unconstitutional and will not survive a court challenge, they're instead just making sure that teacher is never hired or that class is never taught, or if it is taught, it is not allowed to be listed for general education credit so it doesn't enroll, or the university is not allowed to have a DEI office or DEI programming, which, they say, well, DEI staff are staff and not faculty, so they don't have academic freedom. We can restrict what they're doing without violating free speech. Or restricting accreditation standards from accreditors who have DEI standards in most cases for universities, or restricting faculty role in governance or faculty tenure, things like that. So that's the sort of cluster of bills that we've been tracking most commonly in the last couple of years.
Well, I guess the question is, then, what are the best ways that universities fight these things, or how do they deal with it, or are there workarounds, or what are they doing to try to, hold something of themselves still?
Well, it's a very tough situation that they're in because there's a reason, these bills have been challenged on constitutional grounds, a variety of different constitutional grounds. And the one that has been the most successful has been the idea that they are unconstitutionally vague under the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that a bill cannot be vague beyond a certain point of vagueness, or it essentially functions only as a chilling effect to terrify people of the state and does not actually, ban a specific thing. And so it's very hard for universities to figure out how to respond to laws that ban everything and nothing. And even now, even the laws banning DEI, sometimes they'll be a little more specific, but typically their definition of DEI does not really correspond to what a DEI office does, or it corresponds to some aspects of it, but not other aspects. It's completely unclear what these bills ban or don't ban, or whether their bans will stand up in court. And so what universities that do a good job with this do is they don't set out to violate the law. That's not something that we're suggesting, but they don't try to interpret the law beyond what the law actually contains. So if the law has a particular definition of DEI or of things that teachers can't say, they restrict those things, but they don't go beyond that. They don't imagine, well, they didn't really frame it around what DEI actually does, so we're just going to ban our DEI office anyway. No, they don't go beyond what the law says. And what they do is they invest very heavily in supporting their faculty and staff, in supporting the continued mission of diversity, and recognizing that these institutions are, that the primary function of administration is to tell people, you can keep doing what you're doing as much as possible, and we're going to support you in doing that. Now, we have also seen a lot of universities that have not done this, that have caved to pressure, caved to jawboning, overinterpreted laws, and closed down things they didn't have to close down. We're seeing that all over the place. But, that's not what they should be doing.
I'm kind of just thinking back on some of the instances that we've dealt with locally, and it's been a little bit disheartening because I think some of the most pernicious stuff has just happened in darkness. Everybody's trying to save themselves from going down these paths that end up just costing so much time and money and doesn't further the education of students. It doesn't serve communities well, all this kind of stuff. So I feel bad for educational institutions trying to navigate it. They're trying to protect and preserve what little time they already do have to try to do their jobs. And I can understand where it might feel easier to just proactively try to comply with the essence,
But it does not work, and that's the fundamental problem. The institutions are used to responding to, some lawmaker in the state has a concern about their institution, and the correct solution there is go have a constructive conversation, figure out how you're gonna sort of accommodate their need and make some sort of compromise and avoid there being some sort of real challenge. Well, these laws are not coming from the local lawmaker who is proposing them. These laws are coming from the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation and the Goldwater Institute, and they have millions of dollars backing them, and they are part of a national campaign to kneecap higher education. And so pre-complying with these laws does not keep the law from coming. It makes the law worse. They're going to push and push and push until they finally meet some resistance. So we saw this happen in Iowa. The state system in Iowa decided that to stave off a DEI ban, they were going to preemptively ban DEI within the institution. And they thought that this would protect them, I assume, from actual legislation that might be worse. All that happened was that the state of Iowa then passed the most draconian DEI ban that we've ever seen go into law, which included bans on the university commenting on a whole list of 16 different concepts related to gender, race, and diversity, and then following up that list with or any related formulation of these concepts, which could really apply to just about any idea in the world the university is not allowed to talk about, and also banned programming that, quote, was developed in reference to race. Meaning that basically, if you even think about race when you're putting a program together, you're violating the law. And the lawmakers who passed that law claimed that they were simply codifying what the system had already done. So this is a perfect example of how pre-complying with what you think the legislature is going to do is just going to encourage them to do it worse.
Can we talk a little bit about the role of different constituents in higher ed when it comes to resisting these things, pushing back or protecting or making sure they don't happen in the first place? We've just got a whole bunch of different groups: college presidents, college boards, administrators, faculty and staff play a role, obviously. And I feel like even students and alumni sometimes enter this fray. I'm interested to hear how you think those people can be advocates. When is it helpful for them to be vocal? When is it helpful for them to do other things?
Well, I'll say this. The group that I think has the most free hand and the most potential impact to advocate for higher ed, and that we have heard from so far the least, is alumni. The university the state government can't do anything to an alumnus or alumna who wants to speak out on behalf of academic freedom, on behalf of free universities. And some of those alumni have a lot of power and influence. Some of them are powerful business people. Some of them are lawmakers. Some of them are celebrities. Some of them have influence in various ways. Those are people who I think really should be mobilizing and should be trying to speak out on behalf of the institutions. Institutional leaders, boards and presidents, they're in a bit of a trickier spot. I mean, boards have the ability to speak on behalf of the institution, but board members typically in most states are appointed by the governor or by lawmakers in some way. It's not true in every state, but in most. And so there are ways that board members can be replaced if they're too troublesome to the administration. Presidents even more so. I mean, presidents have limited leverage. I think my frustration with boards and presidents sometimes is that I don't think they always use the limited leverage they do have, which is a certain sort of cultural cachet and relationships with lawmakers and things of that sort, to push for this. I think they're more focused on pushing for funding, pushing for appropriations, and that's important. You need that for your university to be successful. But ultimately, a university without a new building is a poor university, but a university without intellectual freedom isn't a university at all. I think this really has to be a central priority in a way that it sometimes isn't. Staff are very limited in what they can do because they are government employees. They work directly for the institution. Faculty have more leeway. Faculty have academic freedom, which extends to extramural speech. They have the ability, in most cases, written into their faculty handbook, to speak publicly on matters of public concern. They can't say they're representing an institution, but they should feel that they can speak with lawmakers, that they can speak to the public, write op-eds, things like that, raise awareness of these concerns. And then students are an interesting group. We have begun to see some more advocacy from students in a way that we hadn't in previous years, particularly around DEI bans and the closure of cultural centers on campuses. And what we've found is that the students speaking up on these issues, lawmakers have been very dismissive of them, but I think somebody needs to call those lawmakers on it, frankly, and say, why are you discounting the voices of students? These are the consumers of the university, right? All these things that we as educators don't like to say about universities, that they're a sort of consumer relationship. But students are the customers, right? They are the people who go to the university. If they feel that this is an important component of their education, that needs to be respected. So we have seen success in places on other issues in K-12, in other countries when universities have been attacked from student movements. And I think there's a real role for students to play going forward.
I can tell you, I teach high school English, and I've had my students tell me that they are surprised to hear that there are books that colleges can't teach. They're not so surprised that there are books that high school doesn't cover, right? But they're always really surprised that there's any kind of control over a college level for the same thing. And it's so interesting to kind of hear them go through it as they start to realize that some of these things are not going to leave them when they leave high school.
Because they're like, we're kids. We have to have more stringent rules. Like, what makes them open to that?
Yeah.
What makes them open to that at the high school level?
Like, I certainly believe that there are absolutely books that should not be taught at high school level. So I totally understand that. But they're always shocked to hear that they could, find something be banned at the next level. And I think that this is going to be an interesting thing for them to be considering, especially as they're applying to schools.
I think a lot of these threats are a little more invisible to students at the college level. I think where we've really seen the shift is with the closure of cultural centers and DEI offices, because students hang out there, they use those centers. That's very clear to them. I think the banning of certain topics is a little less clear. They mostly perceive it as an absence rather than as a presence of something being banned. Whereas if you rip books out of students' hands in high school, or you ban teachers from having pride flags or ally stickers on their walls, that's very clear to a student, and they can sort of organize against that. So only now, I think, really in the last year, have we really started to see college student activism, because they're really being directly impacted in a new way.
Yeah. I feel like with my students, I'm always curious what it will be that causes them to ignite for whatever that purpose may be. But yeah, it's just an interesting thing I've kind of noticed with my kids and their surprise of the control, or attempt of control, rather, at the college level. We come from communities where high trust relationships between constituents and public servants, including those working in schools, have been eroding for some time. So how do learning communities balance the protection of academic freedom with evolving concerns about misinformation? And this is the story of my life teaching in Appalachia right now. This is the $1 million question. So if you have an answer.
Right. I mean, it's a really hard question, because there are all these stories circulating about, book banning campaigns are always focused on misinformation, misunderstandings of what's in a book, misunderstandings of, who's promoting the book or why or what the book is about. This has been the case really since there have been issues around book banning at all. I mean, there's this great, terrifying story from the Kanawha County book ban wars in 1974 in West Virginia, where there was this campaign to ban books that went so far that this local minister and his parishioners started sitting up on this ridge with rifles taking shots at elementary school teachers as they walked into the elementary school. And it concluded with the minister and two of his parishioners planting a bomb in the elementary school and detonating it while no one was there.
How have I not heard of this?
It's an incredible story to try to blame it on the principal, right? And ultimately, the minister and the two parishioners went to jail, right, over this. And they were convinced that the reason they did this is because they were convinced that the elementary school principal and his teachers were promoting smut to elementary school kids, and it became an actual shooting war. So yeah, misinformation is always at the heart of these concerns. I mean, I think it has to be a sort of multi-pronged effort. You have to sort of patiently explain to people what's happening. The challenge actually is not, I think, when people are talking to you and telling you, well, you're assigning smutty books to my kids. It's when they don't talk to you and they go right to the school board, right? This is the issue. I think teachers still have a fairly high level of trust. Parents will, if they will talk to you and you can sort of patiently explain what's going on, then they'll generally listen to you. So I would say that the real focus has to be not so much on the misinformation and more on just doing things to build trust within the community. Having teachers out in the community is especially true at the higher ed level, where institutions are not always as good at being anchor institutions in the community, but doing things that benefit the community, supporting relief efforts, supporting local businesses, just being out there and being present and making it harder for Moms for Liberty to come along and say this person who is teaching your kids is dangerous, and then the parents respond by saying, well, but they were helping, give out food at the food bank last weekend. It just makes it harder for them to do that. So I think that's where the focus has to be.
I think what we see a lot of times is that schools, educational institutions, they aren't necessarily equipped with the best and most cutting edge tools for reaching people. The communication platforms that we use and exist on now, I think, are at odds with the aims of educational institutions. So I totally understand hesitancy in diving into these places and platforms. But I think what that has meant is that schools, colleges, public universities, cultural centers, these places have been left to catch up to the modes of communication in which we're now all engaged. But I think those modes are broken in a lot of ways. There's something to be said for not wanting to participate in it. But then I think what happens in the communication vacuum there is that the noise takes over and becomes the new standard of communicating in communities. And it's just really hard to start reestablishing trust and breaking down boundaries and just making communities feel more like communities.
I think that's absolutely right. Just reasserting the importance of the local community and making that, again, the primary place where these conversations are happening. Because, there's exceptions to this, right? There are local message boards where people, yell at teachers and try to ban books. But ultimately, it's all being driven by this sort of national environment, right? People are reading something on Libs of TikTok and then they're porting that over to their local message board, and that it's not actually coming from within the community. And so I think when you reassert the primacy of the community, you win.
I think from what I've read of your background, you are probably going to be sympathetic to the idea that the humanities are important. But
they seem rather interesting.
Interesting to
I'm
you.
a history professor. So.
Yep. I'd like to know how you think the higher ed landscape that we're in now, where we see all these deep cuts to, arts and humanities and history and cultural programming everywhere, really. Part of it is because of enrollment cliff factors. Part of it is because of these ideological factors. But I hear a lot of times people think that there's been a failure of communicating the value of those programs to incoming students, whoever it may be. Do you think that's true? Do you think where we're going wrong is that we're not communicating value? Or is it just that the values that we are communicating don't line up with what people want anymore? I get a little baffled about it.
It's a hard question. I think there's a lot of things going on. And one of them is simply that there's been disinvestment in higher ed. So it's from state legislatures. So it's harder to support programs that don't have robust enrollments, because they really have to be able to bring in student enrollments, bring in the dollars associated with that in order for the institution to function, because tuition is now such a key funder of higher ed, right? It was not that way as recently as 50 years ago. I think another part of it is that students are very concerned about being able to get a job and not get a job a year or 5 years after they graduate, as some of the studies around history say. Well, if you get a history degree, by the time you're 30, you're going to have the same salary as the person who got a business degree. Well, yeah, but what am I going to have the month after I graduate because I got to pay the rent? Right. I think that's a very valid concern that students have. I think if there's anything that the humanities have not done a good job of and are starting to do a good job of, but it may be a little too late, is communicating not the value of the degree, but the marketability of the degree, the way that you can take that degree and that it really gives you transferable skills, and sort of plugging into career services programs, plugging into job fairs, making sure that students really are able to get a job quickly after they graduate. I think that's That's a missed opportunity, and one, again, I think we're doing better at, but maybe not quickly enough. But I also think that there is a sort of a national narrative that is overtaking us, which has a very simplistic understanding of how the college to career pipeline works, suggesting that, basically you have to be trained for a very specific job. That's what college is for, in order to get that job, which is true in some fields, right? You don't get a job in radiology unless you have a radiology degree. You don't get a job in nursing unless you have a nursing degree. You can't get a history degree by itself and then go become a nurse. But there are a lot of jobs out there where that's not the case. There is just a disconnect in how we talk about that and how we explain that to people. I think there is a little squeamishness about talking about career readiness when it comes to the humanities. I also think that the humanities are being attacked on ideological grounds. There are a lot of forces conspiring to go after the humanities right now. It's also true that the humanities during the Cold War were propped up by enormous amounts of government funding aimed at training, experts in Central Eurasian studies who could, beat the Soviets. And that's not happening anymore. A lot of the people who are trying to shut down ideas on campus related to race, gender, and identity are targeting the humanities because they're a soft target, because they're already bleeding enrollments, because they're already, having these other issues, using that as an opportunity to really silence ideas on campus by shutting down majors, laying off faculty. That is the problem. That is what's challenging with this whole issue of closure of majors. Is you are losing voices on campus. You are losing sets of ideas. You are losing disciplines. You're losing them from general education. You're losing them from the campus conversation and from the community conversation. And that, I think, is something that we have to emphasize. But I also think that we have to be proactive and not just talk about, but make sure we are building real pipelines for professionals to be able to get jobs after they graduate from these programs.
Yeah, I would say that as far as my public high school experience goes, I have more students going into our local tech school for the last 2 years of high school than I've ever seen. And those programs are growing it's huge. I mean, we're fighting for our own students to stay in the high school. And I think it's because exactly what you described, that pipeline. If you go do HVAC, right, it makes sense because you know exactly what's next. Whereas if you get a history degree or an English degree, there's something to be decided there, right? And so that fear.
That makes sense. There's economic stability when, well, or at least the illusion of economic stability when there's a clearer path. Well, like when the job is waiting for me at the end of this trajectory. I do think the liberal arts need to do more articulating of that pathway. And a lot of times it means building better connections with alumni. I think institutions of higher ed are historically awful at doing that. I will just speak from my own very limited perspective here. But as somebody who wants to volunteer and who wants to be an active voice for this kind of thing, I think there just needs to be more work to make those pathways meaningful to people. Your job at Penn America, that's not something that's in one of these career readiness books, but it's cool and vital work that you do. So I think that connecting the dots needs to happen a little more explicitly than it has been.
I completely agree. And I think you'll never hear me say anything bad about trade schools. I think they do great work. I think it's great that students want to enroll in them. What I'd really like to see is a little more convergence between what a trade school offers and what, say, a 2-year college offers. I think that there's no reason that you can't get your HVAC certification and also get some components of general education that will set you up for options in your life, right? They're going to help you, deal with your customers. They're going to help you deal with the changing realities of business. The problem with those certification programs in isolation is that they train you for one thing, and that's the thing you're going to be doing for the rest of your life unless you get additional training. I think building in some training programs that some skills that can be transferred from place to place that can serve you if a particular industry is challenged in various ways. I think that's valuable, and there's got to be a way for us to partner across institution types and make that happen.
What are other countries outside of the United States dealing with, and is there anything we can be learning from them with their resistance or unsuccessful, resistance of censorship and things like that? Like, are there other countries we can look at to say, this is where it could go?
I mean, some of the ideas that we're seeing in higher ed in the U.S. actually come from other countries. In particular, the attacks on higher ed in Hungary have been mirrored directly in some of the things that have happened in Florida. So the New College of Florida, a small public liberal arts college in Florida that was taken over by a new board of trustees appointed by the governor with a bunch of national conservative pundits on the board, and really just sort of ripped down to the studs and reconstituted as a sort of conservative mecca. The whole plan behind that was very clearly modeled off of what happened in Hungary in 2017 and 2018 to Central European University, which was a university funded by George Soros to promote democratic values in, Soros was from Hungary, a country that was rapidly becoming autocratic and authoritarian. And they did some of the same moves at both of those institutions. In both places, they banned the gender studies program. In the case of CEU, they expelled the institution from the country because they argued that it was offering courses in gender studies that it was, and a major in gender studies that it was not allowed to offer under federal law within Hungary. The entire university had to move to Vienna. There really was an effort to mirror that in New College. So we are seeing there's kind of a dialectic. There's a cultural exchange, if you will, of bad ideas about higher ed. There are countries where, the U.S. has been exporting these ideas, like Canada. We see some attacks on critical race theory and DEI in the last couple of years in parts of Canada. And there isn't a lot of evidence from these other countries that you can stand up decisively against these attacks and stop them. But I do think that there are some useful precedents for international cooperation to fight these kind of things. I mean, in Hungary, when they went after CEU, presidents of universities all over the world wrote letters to the government of Hungary, public letters decrying what they had done and denouncing the attacks on the university. And while that didn't make a difference in terms of what happened to CEU in the short term, I do think it chips away at the democratic legitimacy of the government that is doing that. I mean, we've seen, for instance, in Poland, where they also went after universities over an 11-year period of a presidency. Eventually, there was an election, and that president was tossed out. They brought in a president who was much more interested in what the international community had to say about their treatment of universities. So I think it's useful to partner with international partners and try to build up that kind of defense. But this is a tough issue, and it's tough. It's tough for universities to survive in these conditions and to thrive. And it really just requires a bunch of different, they're using a lot of the same strategies we are.
Looking at other countries, if we're to look back in an era of history for some kind of a playbook, is there one that we can look to help protect these academic freedom issues or the censorship issues? And I know that, I'm a fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, so I know people jump really quickly back to the Holocaust and World War II and the book bannings there, and of course things like that. But are there other parts of history that you see kind of coming back around? And did you think that your work with PEN America would maybe pull from your historical education as much as it is, or is that kind of a surprise with your work now?
Well, it's definitely a surprise. My work really focuses on the history of political communication, so I think that is a good preparation for some of the work that we're doing. But as far as historical parallels, I mean, the obvious one is the McCarthy era. Just, censorship, loyalty oaths. I had the great fortune, and this is going to be published very soon, I had the great fortune of doing an interview earlier this month with Harry Kashian, who is a former professor, he taught for most of his career at Fairleigh Dickinson University, English professor. But as a very young man, he was the lead plaintiff in a case called Kashian v. Board of Governors, where he was fired from the University of Buffalo for refusing to sign a loyalty oath. And the Supreme Court ruled in his favor, writing that academic freedom is a transcendent value of the First Amendment. And it really just soaring language, very important. Really the foundation of academic freedom and constitutional jurisprudence from this case. And so, yeah, there's a direct parallel, I think, with what happened there. And just as Harry Kashian did and his colleagues, I think there is a need for faculty to really, foreground this issue and find a way to turn the public tide around it, right? These loyalty oaths were very popular for a very long time, as were other features of McCarthyism and the Red Scare. And what changed public perception of them was really just a sense that they were censorship, that they were silencing educators, silencing teachers and students. And that really made a big difference.
You have an interest in charisma as a sort of area of academic study. Can you tell us what that's about a little bit, how you got interested in that and how it might color some of what you do now?
Well, let me tell you, the beginning of 2017 was a really bad time to release an academic book arguing that charisma in politics was an unabashedly good thing. In truth, I didn't really argue that it was a good thing. I argued that it was a tool that could be used for good or ill. I was interested in this because I was just, I was struck by some of the, to be frank, I hope they're not listening to this podcast, some of the dull as dishwater candidates that political parties nominated for president in the early 2000s. And meanwhile, I'm reading about, Teddy Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan and all these exciting sort of charismatic figures from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And I thought there was something interesting about, in particular, about the relationship that those candidates had with their followers. And so really, I wrote about that. I wrote about the sort of speaking style that those candidates used, and then about how their followers wrote to them. At heart, it's an analysis of follower testimonials, letters that people write to people, and it really is extraordinary. They write to William Jennings Bryan and ran for president in 1896, and they say, you're Moses, you're Jesus Christ. We're going to name our kids after you. Here's a lock of hair of what I found, a lock of hair in the archives from a little baby from 1896 who was named after William Jennings Bryan. There was a family of that named their triplets William Jennings and Bryan. And what I argued ultimately is that this was something that changed America's view of how leaders needed to relate to their followers. That in addition to being a sort of effective politician or effective leader, you also needed to be emotionally available in some way to your followers, and that there was an emotional connection that needed to be part of the political relationship. So it was actually bad to nominate people for president who didn't campaign or didn't connect with voters. And that is something that has persisted into the present day. Now, of course, we are now witnessing the rise of a style of politics that is very concerning, and that sort of draws on these charismatic tools to inspire hate and to inspire attacks on people. And charisma is a tool that can be used for those purposes, but it is also a tool that can be used to inspire people to action, for good actions, for actions that promote democracy, that promote helping people. And that I would say that is really what I've tried to emphasize. And I think that ultimately this was a way of analyzing social movements, analyzing coalitions, that has been very helpful to me in the work that I've done at Penn.
It might not be fair to sum up our current political moment as kind of being enthralled with the charismatic politician. If that's what's happening, if charisma has passed a tipping point from being like the helpful tool to the unhelpful one, how do people pull back the curtain on that? Because if you value charisma, I would imagine it's really hard. If that becomes like the main thing that is valued, it's hard for me to know how to kind of redirect.
Well, I think the desire for charisma is a desire for a certain sort of authenticity. When I think about this, I always remember how if you read the Federalist Papers, the number one person that Madison and Hamilton are arguing with is not King George, it's the Baron de Montesquieu. Which is weird because the Baron de Montesquieu is was viewed as the greatest political philosopher of the day, and probably was. But Montesquieu argued that you could not have a representative democracy or a republic in a large country. He said it could only be done in a small country because it required a sort of affinity with your neighbors and understanding who the voters are and who the people are. And the bigger the country gets, the more unwieldy and impossible it is. And they're very concerned with this argument, and constantly saying, Montesquieu doesn't know what he's talking about. We're going to build a system that runs on these sort of small states that make up a large system, and so it'll be fine. But I think that there's some truth in what Montesquieu was saying. I think it's, as the country has grown, I mean, this is a country of over 300 million people. It's very hard for people to feel like what goes on in Washington, D.C. Represents them or has any direct connection to them. They feel helpless, feel disconnected from their government. And I think charisma is a way of providing that kind of connection that makes you feel like, well, there's somebody out there who's fighting for you. If we look at it that way, then we can see that there are a variety of ways to demonstrate authenticity, to demonstrate that people are fighting for you. I'm really struck by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, after winning her reelection, went on X and asked people, specifically people who had voted for her and for Trump, why they did it. And what they mostly said was, well, you both seemed really authentic. right? You seem like real people. You don't seem scripted. And so that tells you that at some level, people are looking for that authenticity, maybe more than they're looking for particular issue positions. And that's something that can be provided in a variety of ways.
Kate, that reminds me of the conversation you had about code switching with your kids in your class.
They were talking about, my school district is not at all diverse, so I'll just start there. But they were talking about how she could be both Indian and Black, and how sometimes she sounds different when she speaks, is how they described it. And I asked them if they could remember what situations she was speaking in, like what were the scenarios, and they named a couple different ones. And I looked at them and I said, do you all think that I speak to you the way that I speak to my parents or my partner or whatever, my friends? And they were like, well, no. And I was like, so what would be the point if you're trying to appeal to all these people to only speaking the exact same way in front of every group and not showing that you somehow can acclimate or understand or speak in a way that reaches them? It was kind of wild because something that I think that is like a racism, right, became something that they understood, but they never just heard it boiled down so simply. And then I was like, gosh, if we would just say these things as simply as they can be and not hide them behind.
You took it out of the realm of an op-ed because that was happening. People were writing pieces about Harris's code switching. It crystallizes the conversation. It makes it a thing to argue about instead of a thing to understand. And the moment that you had in your class, I thought was kind of valuable because it was the moment of understanding that's behind that before the op-ed gets filtered through the political rage machine of social media. All right. Well, I think that'll about wrap it up. We like to just ask people one thing that they have learned in the last couple of weeks. Doesn't have to be related to your work.
What have I learned in the last couple of weeks? I've learned that I am very sensitive to the chemicals in Swiffer pads.
Yes.
Which I did not used to be, but I've been, hopefully this has all been cut out of this episode, but I've been sniffling and,
you'll be
coughing
fine.
And sneezing through the episode thanks to the Swiffer pads. So that's probably the most interesting thing that I've learned over the last couple of weeks.
I've been learning about the women of Star Trek. I got a book for Christmas to indulge my nerdy pursuits, and that's what I've been learning about. How about you, Kate? What have you been up to?
I'm about to start a book on the secret life of Jackie O. So that'll be what I learn when I start it.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a fascinating conversation. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
Great. Thanks. Hey, listeners. Thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show.